Okay, today we're going to talk about some major attempts at resistance amongst Latin American countries to U.S. dominance, mostly in the 1960s and 70s, and as the U.S. kind of reasserts some amount of control in the early 1980s. And these three countries on this list are uh, really instructive because the United States argues quite often that it supports democracy and freedom, but we've seen in certain areas that the United States supports dictatorship when it's in the U.S. interest to do so. So these three countries are interesting in their history in relations with the United States because these three countries go back and forth between democracy and dictatorship in the 50s through the 70s. And the United States doesn't seem to take much interest in these countries, whether they have a dictatorship or a democracy, very much, until whichever government that exists starts to threaten U.S. power in the region, or the United States starts to want something from those governments. So the U.S. will really get involved in these governments at certain points in their history, not because they have a certain kind of government, a dictatorship or a democracy, but because the United States has some kind of natural resource or some other interest in the country itself. And the kind of case studies of these three countries will reveal that the United States will negotiate and make demands with any type of government, democracy or dictatorship, just depending on if that government is willing to negotiate with the United States. And the U.S. will make its policy decisions based on its own economic interest rather than what kind of government or how much freedom those countries have going on at the time. So first country on our list is Ecuador, going back to about 1940s. There is one important major politician in Ecuador who was in and out of politics for several decades. His name is Jose Maria Velasco Ibarra. So he has won presidential elections before in democracies. The first couple times from winning in 1934, he was overthrown by a military dictatorship in 35. Then he won another election in 44, stayed a few years, and then was overthrown in 47. So he runs again for the presidency in 1952 and won, and actually served an entire term as president without getting overthrown. Chose not to run for re-election in 56. So other politicians run, and they run Ecuador for those 4 years. And he decides to make a comeback in 1960 and runs his 1960 election campaign like his other ones that he had run before, based on promises of what economists tend to call public works. He says if he's elected, he's going to push the government to build a lot of roads and bridges and schools. And the real big thing for Ecuador at the time is to build electricity generating plants, because a lot of Ecuadorians are poor and they don't have access to electricity in their homes or businesses. They live in kind of small rural towns. Ecuador had largely transitioned to banana production as the centerpiece of its economy in the 1950s, and Ibarra had something to do with that when he was president for about the first half of the decade. But world banana prices start going down in a very large scale in the early 1960s, which did a lot of harm to the overall national economy. So a lot of wealthy interest and a lot of investment capital is leaving Ecuador in the early 1960s because of this drop in the price of its major cash crop. And Ibarra seemed to respond to this fairly slowly, which angered a lot of workers who make big demands for the government should protect their wages, so they don't want to see wage cuts, and they often even go on strike. So there's a series of kind of cascading worker strikes in 1961 that reveals his unpopularity amongst the voters at this point, just 1 year into his term of office. So eventually the military had to intervene to stop a lot of these strikes because the government argued they were getting out of control and they're chaotic. So the military ended the strikes, put the workers back into their jobs. So when Ibarra is overthrown in 61, the military does not take over at this point. They instead install the vice president. They promote him to be the next president. His name is Monroy. His policies are much more focused on kind of foreign policy. He mostly wanted Ecuador to break away from these Cold War alliance systems. He wanted Ecuador to have a foreign policy that was not favorable to either the United States or the Soviet Union or any of its allies. So that angered the United States quite a lot and created a lot of fear in the United States that Ecuador would become like another Cuba. Remember, this is 1961, 62, just a couple years after Castro has succeeded in Cuba, and the U.S. government is actively looking to assassinate him. So the United States government is very afraid of Monroy, and there's a lot of rumors and fears that he's like a closet communist, and if he doesn't want to have relations with the U.S., he must want to turn Ecuador toward communism and join the Soviet alliance. And Monroy further angered the United States by refusing to break foreign relations with Cuba. So that was a kind of a litmus test that the U.S. government often demanded of other Latin American governments to break relations with Cuba, and that would the U.S. leaders felt would reveal how favorable those Latin American leaders were toward communism in the first place. But he doesn't do much kind of successfully to run the economy, so the big problem that had pushed Ibarra out of office in the first place is festering, and workers are still not happy with him. So the military deposed him, kicked him out of office, and at that point start a dictatorship to run the country. And the military dictatorship lasts a couple years, and they actually do a fairly good job of running the economy. They reform the tax code to get more government revenue. They get the government budget deficit under control. They ended the native sharecropping system, which was a huge source of poverty and oppression throughout the country. They raised tariffs, which are taxes on imports, which even a lot of rich Ecuadorians did not want that. So even the dictatorship stands up against its own wealthy elite in the tariff debates. But the military leaders are not so much interested in keeping control over the country for the long term, so they only stay in office and keep running the government for about 2 years, and they basically leave. They resign in 1965 without leaving behind any real plan for how to build a new government or what that new government would have power to do or anything like that. So kind of provisional government took over for almost 2 years, just a little under 2 years. And the main problem seems to be that neither the military nor the rich elites nor any major kind of political party could build a popular movement enough to like win an election or take power or anything like that. So from 63 going into about 60 or 65 going into 68, there's a lot of questions about what government system is going to run Ecuador and who's going to lead that system. And eventually elections are called for 1968, and our old friend Ibarra comes back and runs in 1968 for president again on the same promises of more mass public programs, roads and schools and hospitals and electricity plants and all these types of things. And he won the election based on that, so he wins the election for, what, the 5th time? So he'll be inaugurated as president in 68. But right when he enters office, he seems to realize that the government doesn't have enough revenue to actually pay for all those things that he has promised. And when the National Congress refused to support his economic plans, they basically refused to raise more revenue by raising taxes or cutting the budget in other areas or something like that. When Congress kind of took a hard stand against his proposals, he got the military to help him build a new dictatorship. And he says that this is intended to save the country from total ruin. There's a lot of critics in Ecuador that he has that really criticize him for having done this. So there's a lot of, especially university students, college students that are really angry about this, and they start speaking out and protesting to the point where Ibarra closes several universities in order to stop that opposition and those large protest movements from growing even larger against him. A lot of his most outspoken opponents were exiled, kicked out of the country, forced to go somewhere else. And Ibarra says he's doing all this to kind of restructure the economy and restructure the government, make them more efficient. But the dictatorship that he leads pretty much lacks working class support on any level. They did not build any kind of independent foreign policy, or they were not able to fully break away from former foreign deals, especially with the United States. So Ibarra has made a lot of promises that he's not really keeping, so there's a lot of public anger against him going into the early 70s. He does make deals with U.S. companies to borrow money to finance these public works that he has promised. So in the early 70s, the Ecuadorian government starts borrowing huge amounts of money from U.S. banks and whatnot in order to pay for all those roads and schools and bridges and things that he wanted to build. So right after the military dictatorship from 63 to 65 had finally gotten a hold over that government deficit and had made some kind of plan to try to tamp down the national debt, here comes Ibarra. He ramps up the borrowing a bit, and that really buries the Ecuadorian government in debt, and it will remain so for at least another 10 years. So the military leaders never really seem to trust him very much. He talks about democracy every once in a while, but he doesn't dare try to implement democracy because he'd probably be voted out of office pretty quickly because he doesn't have the support of the general population. So in 1972, the military's kind of had it with this guy, and they kick him out, and so he's kicked out of government again. He's overthrown, and the military builds a new dictatorship that will last for quite a while this time. We'll go through 1979. So the new military dictatorship stays in office for several years. The biggest thing that the military leaders do is to open up oil development. Oil was just recently discovered in large quantities in Ecuador in the very late 60s. So in the early 70s, the government is trying to figure out, do they want to sell that oil? How are they going to mine it? Who are they going to allow to mine it and sell it? So the military dictatorship after 72 will kind of make these big decisions for the people, basically. And their decision is to create basically government entities, government-run companies, to extract the oil and sell it on the worldwide markets. And any private companies that had so far been involved in doing that are failing, the government nationalizes, which means the government takes over the failing oil companies that are not doing well economically. And the military leaders also set up kind of state-owned banks to lend the money to get all this going. And Ecuador will also join OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries that got going in the mid-60s. OPEC is basically a group of countries that produce oil and sell it on the worldwide market, and their general goal is to raise oil prices around the world. These countries felt that they had been taken advantage of for decades, often going back to the early 1900s, that especially American and British oil companies had been allowed into their countries and have been allowed to mine the oil for very kind of cheap fees, and that they mine so much oil that they oversupply the market in order to guarantee that oil prices and gasoline prices, especially in the United States, are kept very low. So they oversupply the market in order to keep the price low for gasoline buyers and other oil consumers. So OPEC gets going in the 60s in order to try to stop that. So their strategy will be the exact opposite. They want to see prices rise so that they can sell their oil for larger amounts of money and use that money as government revenue to help their people out of poverty. So OPEC's strategy is to reduce the supply of oil, which means cut back on oil production in order to drive up the price on the world market. And that's what largely causes a lot of the kind of gas lines in the United States, where gasoline suddenly goes from literally about 50 cents a gallon and can go up 5 or 6 times that amount in just a month or two. So a lot of workers in Western countries that depend on gasoline or oil to get to work or whatever they need to do, they're in a very bad economic place because they cannot afford to buy enough gasoline to get to work. So this is a big economic shock, especially in the United States, that will last throughout the 70s as OPEC does this again and again and again. So Ecuador joins OPEC, which hugely angers the United States, because the United States leaders and the U.S. population are generally angry at OPEC just by default in the 1970s, and any new country that joins OPEC will become a target of American anger. In 1975, there is another military coup. So there's a military dictatorship, but another group of military officers overthrew that dictatorship and created a new military dictatorship, mostly because they argued that the military leaders from 72 to 75, they were too hardcore, they were too restrictive, and the new military leaders want to start a transition toward democracy. So they really rewrite the Ecuadorian constitution, and under that constitution they call for free democratic elections to be held in 79. And the most famous candidate who runs in those elections is named Jaime Roldos Aguilera. He's a very young guy. He's only 39 years old by 1979. He hadn't really been in government very much. He was a career economist and lawyer to that point. So he runs for the highest office. He goes right for the presidency. And his campaign is based on using oil profits to build infrastructure to help the poor people of Ecuador, basically pull them out of poverty as much as possible. So he also wants to build the infrastructure projects that Ibarra had talked about for years and years, but he has a better economic plan to do it because now he has this vast oil supply, and by 79 the price of oil is peaking throughout the world, and Ecuador has quite a lot of it. So he says he wants to use government-owned oil companies to extract the oil and sell it on in the international market and make so much money back that they'll easily be able to afford to build the schools and universities and roads and dams and bridges and electricity plants and all those things that will bring the general Ecuadorian population out of poverty. So this is a very popular idea amongst the Ecuadorian voters. And in this election, there's several people running for president. The first round of voting happens in 1978. And none of the candidates got a majority because there were like 6 candidates or something. So it was very unlikely for any one of them to get over 50% of the votes and win outright. So Roldos got the highest amount of votes. He got 31%. So he was the biggest vote getter in the first round. So then the voting goes to a runoff election. And the Ecuadorian military is very afraid of this guy. They really don't want him in office. So the Ecuadorian military kind of quietly conspires with U.S. leaders to try to figure out how to keep him out of office. The first idea was that the military rulers that are still running the country until the election is done, they decide to try to delay the runoff for 9 months, which is quite a long time. You know, most runoff elections that you see around the world, they happen like the next month after, just 1 month after the first round. So to delay it for almost a year is fairly ridiculous, and they were largely hoping that Roldos would do something unpopular, they could find some dirt on him to expose that would tank his popularity and keep him out of office. That didn't happen, and the United States tried to assassinate him in those 9 months, but he survived. So eventually the runoff vote is held in August of 79, and he won 69%, which is a huge majority. So he is obviously the choice of the Ecuadorian people, and the military can't really stop it at this point, so they really give up and allow him to be inaugurated. So he becomes president of Ecuador in 1979 toward the end of the year. And his policies are pretty clearly on the side of working people. Immediately when he became president, he issued decrees very late in the year, right in December, that cut the official national work week to only 42 hours a week. So you can imagine how much the average Ecuadorian worker actually worked before that, where 42 hours a week is like a great success and a great piece of progress for them. And then he doubled the minimum wage in the country. So those are two obvious policies right off the bat that are aimed at helping poor people who work a lot but don't make a lot of money. He introduces his proposal for the oil sales laws in 1980, and had a lot of enemies in the Congress that tried to vote it down, but he eventually got it through and got it passed. So his campaign promises are going to go into effect starting in 1980. And he's going to start using that money to build out all this stuff. And in September 1980, he attended a Latin American leadership summit, other national leaders of the other Latin American countries. And at that meeting, he called for what he said was a humanitarian-based policy that all Latin American countries should endorse that would guarantee human rights and justice objectively under what became known as the Roldos Doctrine. So he said that all countries in Latin America should commit to guarantee human rights, which means they won't oppress or jail or torture or kill off or exile people for political beliefs, and there should be freedom of speech and freedom of owning property and all these kinds of things that just general human rights around most of the world. So that was viewed very favorably in Latin America, and very quickly, within a year of becoming president, many people in Latin America are looking at Roldos as a potential long-term leader that can undo or help at least alleviate a lot of the horror stories that are coming out of these Latin American dictatorships of oppression and rampant murder and all these kinds of things that have been going on for quite a long time. So a lot of Latin Americans are looking for leadership, regional leadership, throughout the Americas from Roldos to hopefully lead all Latin American countries into a new era of kind of equality and prosperity. And Ecuador has a possibility of doing this. It's a fairly small country, but it's becoming a very rich country fairly quickly because they all have so much oil to sell. And if they can build up their own society, they could become a major example to other Latin Americans about how to rebuild their government and get it working much better. A lot of people in the United States, especially conservative politicians, hated Roldos for his doctrine, because the doctrine, if it's implemented, would possibly overthrow a lot of U.S.-backed dictatorships throughout the region. So a lot of U.S. politicians and foreign policy leaders and military thinkers are very worried that Roldos's idea will overthrow U.S.-backed dictatorships throughout the region, which might further invite Soviet influence, or if you overthrow these dictatorships, communist parties might win elections and you might get communism rising in different places in Latin America. So a lot of U.S. leaders are very paranoid about Roldos and his idea and how popular it immediately is amongst many Latin Americans throughout the whole region. So largely in opposition to Roldos's idea, some conservative politicians run for the U.S. presidency and U.S. elections in 1980, and they win, and they take office in January 1981. And quickly after that, Roldos is killed in a plane crash just a few months later in May. And much of the Latin American population throughout the whole region immediately accused the new U.S. government under President Reagan of having assassinated Roldos in order to stop this general Latin American-wide movement for greater human rights. So there's a lot of conspiracy theories. There's a lot of coincidental evidence that seem to point to U.S.-led conspiracy to have him assassinated. But in the end, there's no direct, clear proof that's ever produced that the U.S. did this. But a lot of Latin Americans still believe it to this day, and they still call for international investigations going on 40 years later. When Roldos was assassinated, his vice president became the new president and largely caved in to the demands of especially U.S. oil companies to largely get rid of most of the state-owned Ecuadorian oil companies that were doing the oil drilling and selling and whatnot. So the new president largely demobilized those state-owned companies and allowed U.S. oil companies to enter into Ecuador and start drilling and extracting oil and selling it without any preconditions or any like environmental cautions or any decent minimum wages for the workers doing it or anything like that. So a lot of Ecuadorians are very upset that this new president, starting in kind of spring, summer 1981, starts doing this, and they view him very often as kind of a national sellout. So that's where Ecuador ends up in the early 1980s. And the next country on our list is Panama. The United States had kept control over Panama in as much as it possibly could, and we've talked about this throughout the course, especially since the United States built a canal in Panama that the U.S. military views as a central piece of being able to protect the United States from invasion or attack, and also to just move its military around wherever it wants quickly without having to go around the southern tip of South America. So we've talked about all that pretty extensively before, but just as a reminder, the U.S. government intervened in Panama, often sending troops into Panama in 1908, 1912, 1918, 1925, in order to, the U.S. government says, quell, quote, unrest in Panama, but many historians suspect that it's more of an attempt by the U.S. government to control the Panamanian government and make sure that the U.S. has constant rights and control over the Panama Canal. A couple decades later, in the 30s, the Panamanian government asked to renegotiate the Canal Treaty with the United States, and did get a new treaty that had some amount of progress for Panama. Mostly ended the U.S. government's right to intervene in Panama's politics whenever it wanted. So you see a general end to the U.S. sending troops into Panama to overthrow or influence the Panamanian government. And this treaty in 1936 also increased the fees that the United States has to pay on a yearly basis to use the canal, and forced the United States government to promise to build a highway from one side of the canal, from the north side to the south side. So they do get some amount of progress, some amount of better promises from the U.S. in that new treaty that's passed in 1936. But the big thing that the Panamanian governments, whenever they want to renegotiate the treaty, the big thing they almost always want is to take over the canal as Panamanian property again, and to basically charge any boat that goes through a flat rate from any country. It doesn't really matter. So the U.S. is usually opposed to that, and they refused to negotiate that point for many decades. There's also another attempt at renegotiation in 1941, where Panama wanted to demand that the U.S. pay more money per year again to use the canal, and some property rights were negotiated. And Panama actually promised, if the U.S. gives in to those demands, that the U.S. would be able to station many more troops in the Panama Canal zone in 1941, which the U.S. was really interested in because this is right when the U.S. is getting ready to enter World War II, so it views the Panama Canal as absolutely central to its ability to fight the war in both Europe and against Japan. So the United States is very interested in being able to put as many troops as it wants in the Panama Canal Zone to protect it as a resource to move troops and goods back and forth around the world. But the Panamanian government really wasn't kind of giving in to what the U.S. wanted, so the U.S. backed a military coup to remove the president from office, which successfully happened in 1941. The president's removed, and then the U.S. Gets its deal to station as many troops as it wants in the Canal Zone during the war. And after the war, after 1945, for about 10 years going to the 1950s, Panamanian politics are pretty chaotic. There are elections. Many of them are fraudulent. There are attempts at coups. There are assassinations of political leaders. So there's a lot of political instability in Panama itself going into the 1950s. Probably the most powerful politician in this whole era is the president in the early 50s, who was a former colonel in the army named Jose Antonio Ramon Quintero. And he becomes president in 1952, and he immediately demands another renegotiation of the Canal Treaty. And these negotiations drag on for 3 years because his big interest is to try to get the Canal Zone back for Panamanian control, and the U.S. would have to kind of pay to just pass through the canal. But the United States refused to give in to those demands, so it drags on for 3 years. The eventual result is signed in 1955, where again the United States will pay an increased yearly fee for its boats to pass through the canal on pretty much an unlimited basis. So the yearly, what we call annuity payment, because you pay it per year, per annum, the annuity payment increases pretty dramatically. So the Panamanian government gets some more government revenue, but they're not getting back what they really want, which is direct control over the canal. In this treaty, there's also a clause that gives wage increases to Panamanian workers that are working in the canal zone. But again, nothing on returning sovereignty over the canal to the Panamanian government. And then Quintero was assassinated in 1955. So there's a lot of suspicions that he was assassinated through a plot led by the U.S. government, directly because he was demanding these things of the U.S. government, and he was taking a hard bargaining position. And that sends us into the 1960s, where there is an election called in 1968, where a former very popular Panamanian politician named Arias runs for the presidency again in 68. He had run a couple times before and won elections in 1940 and 1949, but had been overthrown by the military each of those times. So he runs for office again in 68, and he wins again in 1968. But again, the military does not trust this guy. He wants a lot of things that the military is fairly opposed to. So he is inaugurated, and then the military overthrow him after only 11 days in office. And they put one of their head generals, named Omar Torrijos Herrera, into office as the new president under dictatorship. So this is going to be a military dictatorship. But Torrijos is a very different type of dictator. He's not extremely repressive. He doesn't allow elections, but there's a lot of research that shows that the general population were very supportive of Torrijos. He had been born into poverty, so he knew what it was like to live in poverty and work as a young person in poverty, and his way out was to join the military at a young age. And he rose to the ranks through the years to eventually become general, but he never forgot where he came from. There's a lot of reports that he would often visit poor sections of Panama and hold kind of open public meetings as a general to talk with the public at random to see what their concerns were, and he would make promise about fixing things, and he would actually try to fix some things that they complained about in their localities. So there's a lot of kind of popular stories about how much the poor people love Torrijos. And as president, he's going to enact, or at least attempt, several major policy changes and take the country in a fairly new direction in a lot of ways. The first is that he openly and publicly demanded that Panama should retake sovereignty over the Canal Zone. And of course, that was an extremely popular idea in Panama itself across the entire population, because they felt so historically victimized by the United States, and they knew it was because the U.S. wanted to control that canal. So Torrijos said publicly and clearly that this is Panamanian land, and it really always has been, and that the treaty has to be renegotiated in order to get Panamanian control back over that land and over the entire canal itself. He also wanted to offer open asylum to Latin American dissidents from all over the region. And a dissident is really someone who just opposes the government, who doesn't think that things are going well, is very critical of the government, and often someone that the government targets as a troublemaker that especially a lot of Latin American dictators wanted to get rid of. So a lot of dissidents have been targeted in their own countries. They've been jailed and tortured, executed, exiled, all kinds of things. So Torrijos wanted to open Panama as a refuge for dissidents from all Latin American countries and across the political spectrum. He wanted to offer asylum to conservative, wealthy Cuban elites who hated Castro's movement and felt very persecuted by Castro and just wanted to get out of the country, and he offered them to come to Panama. But he also did the same for the much more liberal, leftist, and even communist groups that were fleeing Chile after the U.S. overthrew Salvador Allende and put in the Pinochet dictatorship. So Torrijos argues that Panama should be open to asylum for all Latin Americans, no matter what their political beliefs are, if they can't live in their own country due to fear. Torrijos also wanted to get Panama away from the entrapment of the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union were demanding that countries virtually all over the world demand that they take sides in the Cold War. And Torrijos didn't like that because he thought it was a way of dividing up the world into empires, and that individual countries should have a choice. They could willingly join with the U.S. or the Soviet Union to fight out the Cold War or try to win it for one side or the other. But he thought that nations and governments should have the choice to not be involved in that at all. They should be able to basically opt out and escape the alliance systems that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were building up and had been building up for decades by this point in the late 60s. So Torrijos was smart enough to understand, as most Panamanians did, that the United States had dominated their country since the early 1900s, and they're fairly sick of it and they want it ended. But Torrijos also understood that Castro had done the same things in Cuba, but that Castro had, instead of just merely proclaiming full independence, he had turned to the other side for protection. So he overthrew the U.S.-backed dictatorship in Cuba, but within a couple of years he started recruiting assistance and protection from the Soviet side. And Torrijos disagreed with that. He thought that there wasn't much point in trading out your subservience to one side just to be subservient to the other. So Torrijos took a fairly non-ideological stance in the Cold War. He was upset that the U.S. had victimized Panama for so long, but he also was very hesitant and eventually outright refused to join the Soviet side just because he didn't like what the U.S. had historically done. So he wanted to find a third way, what many historians and even politicians at the time called the non-aligned movement, which meant that countries should have the choice to not be involved in this Cold War alliance system. They want to find a third way to basically be neutral in the Cold War. So many Latin Americans looked to Torrijos, again, as a possible turning point to not just stop U.S. dominance in their own country, but to stop the growth of corporate power and foreign banks in their country, and to define human rights, equality, social justice, and environmental sovereignty and good environmental planning as the core ideas that Latin America should go with. And by doing that, they would break themselves away from the Cold War paradigm. So many Latin Americans look to him as a possible major leader if he is able to pull this off and standing up to the United States and getting something done on the canal. That could be a great example to other Latin Americans that they could do the same in their own countries. And of course, the United States was very resistant to that idea as well. Torrijos also wanted to end the School of the Americas, which was an institution that the United States ran in the Panama Canal Zone that trained other Latin American dictatorships in repressing their own populations. So other Latin American countries that were under U.S. influence would send their spy leaders, their military leaders, even some of their politicians to the School of the Americas in Panama, where the U.S. government, largely the CIA, would train them in covert operations, counterintelligence, interrogation that included torture, general things to monitor and repress their societies. So this is where the United States largely trained Latin American dictatorships under its control in how they could stay in control of their own countries. So most Latin Americans hated this School of the Americas. They were aware of it. Torrijos was certainly aware of it. And one of his public demands was to end this thing and kick the U.S. personnel who were running this so-called school all the way out of Panama and to end it completely. So Latin Americans throughout the region were very supportive of this, obviously, because they know what the school had been doing for many years by this point. Torrijos also wanted to build an expanded canal, and more importantly, one that was at sea level, because the current canal that the United States was operating was above sea level. Therefore, it had to have the engineering systems to trap water and raise the water level so that the ships could float through at a depth to get them to the other side. So Torrijos thought that this was inefficient and it was an outdated system, and he wanted to build a new canal at sea level that wouldn't require all that massive engineering to move the water levels up and down. Such a canal would probably be larger, it would be more efficient, and Torrijos did not want to hire U.S. companies to build it because they were either not interested because they were afraid of losing access to the canal that already exists, which would probably be closed because it's so much less efficient. And Torrijos offered construction contracts to Japanese companies to build the new canal at sea level because Japan was the biggest worldwide canal customer by the 1970s. It was sending more boats through the existing canal than any other country. So Torrijos wants to cut off a lot of U.S. influence over Panama and open negotiations with other countries, particularly on a canal. And the United States was very angry about that idea, and especially U.S. corporations who wanted to gain those contracts, not just to control the canal into the future, but also because it's a giant engineering contract. It's a government contract, and companies tend to make a lot of money off of those. So when Torrijos started talking about signing a contract with non-U.S. companies, U.S. companies who were expecting to get that contract in the first place became very angry and started making contact with the politicians that they could influence in Washington, D.C. And Torrijos realized that if he's going to try to accomplish all these major foreign policy goals, that he and Panama could be a target of U.S. revenge. So he figured one of the best ways to avoid that possibility would be to get world opinion on his side. So if the United States started speaking out against what Panama was doing under his leadership, then the rest of the world would kind of come to his defense. And he figured the best way to get that worldwide support would be to invest in infrastructure on a massive scale in Panama, particularly electricity generating plants to bring electricity to the poverty-ridden areas, to build new roads and schools and hospitals, and to generally end the mass poverty in Panama as it existed at the time. And he figured if he could do that, that would gain the worldwide support for his government that might be able to head off some type of U.S. invasion or something of Panama. The problem, though, is that, again, he needs the money to get that going, to pay up front for the infrastructure projects that he wanted to build. So he went to the IMF and the World Bank and other international organizations and sought major loans for Panama to build that public infrastructure in the first place, figuring that building the public infrastructure and all these other foreign policy things he wanted to accomplish would build up the Panamanian economy so much, you'd see such a massive rise in economic growth that over the long term Panama would be able to pay off those loans that they needed to get the whole process started. And the other thing he wants to do in foreign policy is to get control over the existing Panama Canal. So when he went into office in 1968-69, he started asking to negotiate a new canal treaty with the United States. And the U.S. leaders at that time were completely resistant and would be until the mid-1970s, when the U.S. elected a new president in 1976 named Jimmy Carter. And he was a more kind of forward-thinking type of president. He ran his campaign on the idea that the United States should not try to oppress foreign countries to win the Cold War, but should just gain their support through making good deals and be nice to them and supporting humanitarian projects and whatnot. So Carter is a very different type of U.S. leader. So in his term in office, he'll be much more open to ending support for dictatorships and stopping a lot of the stuff the United States has been doing since the Cold War started to control Latin America. So when Carter goes into office in 1977, he is very willing to start renegotiating a Panama Canal Zone treaty with Torrijos in Panama. And this comes to a head in 1978 when the treaty is actually finished and signed. And this is a picture of that moment where the U.S. signed off on a deal to hand over the total canal zone sovereignty to Panama by the end of the century. So the United States will get about another 20 years or so of control over the canal, but the deal says that by the year 2000 that sovereignty will shift to the Panamanian government. Liberals in the United States were very happy at this and thought this was a just thing to do. Conservatives denounced the treaty and a lot of other things that Carter had done in office. By 1980, the next presidential election, they had denounced Carter as naive and giving away U.S. power and opening the door to the possibility of communists taking over Latin American countries like Panama. So conservatives really denounced Carter as not really knowing what he's doing for the long term and just giving away so much U.S. power that the U.S. might lose the Cold War as a result. So that was one of the big debates in the U.S. elections in 1980, and the conservatives won the 1980 elections and will go into office in 1981. So they will bring U.S. foreign policy kind of back to its Cold War aggressive normalcy after Carter leaves office in January of 81. And just a few months after the conservatives in the U.S. enter, the next summer, Torrijos is killed in a helicopter crash, which most of the world assumes that the CIA did in order to assassinate him and remove him from office. And we have to remember that this is just 2 months after President Roldós in Ecuador was possibly assassinated in a similar plane crash. So within about 4 months of this new U.S. administration entering office on a much more aggressive foreign policy stance than Carter, then you have two of the biggest and most famous Latin American leaders that are taking a clear and public stand against U.S. dominance over Latin America are both killed under fairly suspicious circumstances by the end of summer 1981. And that sends us into the next country we're going to talk about, which is Peru. Peru had been back and forth between military dictatorships and kind of leftist populist democracy for about 50 years, going into the 1960s, from the 19-teens into the 60s. So it's been back and forth, back and forth. when democracy is in place, populists tend to win those democratic elections. They go into office, then a military coup knocks them out. Then a few years later, the military gives up and opens elections again. And again, it just goes back and forth for about 50 years. Generally, by the 1960s, the Peruvian peasants were outraged at the civilian government's lack of reforms, lack of kind of openness, and there's a lot of accusations of corruption amongst the democratic politicians. So some civilians started guerrilla war in the 1960s to try to influence the government or start some kind of national revolution against the government. So there's a civilian government in office, but even the pro-democracy type forces, that they basically say it's not working well enough, so they start this, what they proclaim as a nationwide revolution. So the democratically elected president has to send in the army and to try to knock out the revolutionary guerrillas, and the fighting kills thousands of civilians by 1968. The president also tried to negotiate with foreign oil companies, but especially the U.S. oil companies were very hostile toward him. So there's a lot of popular outrage that just kind of grows and grows and grows throughout the 60s until you get a military coup in 1968. And military leaders used that popular anger as an excuse to knock that president out and set up a new dictatorship under a general named Juan Velasco Alvarado. Alvarado's new government will stay in office for a little while, about a decade, and his big promise is to build what he calls basically a balanced economy that will not be fully capitalist and will not be fully communist. So he wants to find a middle ground between the two that will use capitalism to get economic growth, but will also use some amount of socialism to regulate the economy and try to end inequality in the country and poverty as much as possible. And his new government is absolutely obsessed with being independent from foreign powers, either from the capitalist United States or from the communist Soviet bloc. He genuinely wants to help the poor peasants of the country, but he does not want to have to take sides in the Cold War. So this is yet another Latin American leader, this time under a dictatorship, that is trying to proclaim an independent path for Latin America, at least for his own country, to basically opt out of the Cold War and to make deals with both sides as are kind of necessary and fitting for whatever position his country is in at the time. Velasco's government also started a very large land expropriation and redistribution system, very similar to what we've seen in other Latin American countries up to this time. Goes after the excess lands of giant landowners and their estates, where the government will take over land in excess of a certain amount of acreage and will redistribute that land to the poor peasants. His government also created what they called the National System for Support of Social Mobilization, which translated to an acronym which was CINAMOS in Spanish, which generally the acronym translates to Without Masters in English. And that's a fairly vague title for something, but it was generally the government's attempt to support peasants and the working class in cities, and to also consolidate the land-based reforms that they're already running. And most historians see this as a big attempt to bring together all the working classes from all their different jobs. Peasants out in the fields, peasants working on larger estates as farmers, or even the working class in the amount of industry that Peru has at the time in the big cities, to kind of bring them all together as a block of kind of working class definition and therefore political support for the government, as long as the government is kind of meeting their demands. So it looks like to historians that this is the Alvarado's government's attempt to link the masses together into one kind of organized political faction in order to appeal to it so that this dictatorship can stay in power. Alvarado and the government next tried to get rid of foreign capital out of Peru, so tried to kick a lot of foreign companies out. because a lot of those foreign companies had gained fairly monopolistic control over Peru's most important natural resources. So the Alvarado government does run some nationalizations of foreign companies especially. And the government will demand that Peruvian nationals, people born and raised in Peru, basically Peruvian citizens, will own a majority of stock in any foreign company that is allowed to continue to exist inside Peru itself. He also starts talking about building a canal for Peru, not so much an isthmus canal to move boats back and forth across the Pacific and Atlantic, because Peru is completely on the Pacific side. So the canal that Alvarado and the government want to build is more of an irrigation canal to bring water out of the mountainous areas of Peru and into the lower elevation and very arid, dry areas, so that they can open up those lands to much more farming. U.S. companies wanted the contract to build that thing because, again, these are government contracts that can be very profitable. But Alvarado didn't really trust these U.S. companies so much, so he started negotiating with a engineering company in Yugoslavia, which is a country that has very close ties to the Soviet Union politically. So the U.S. was very critical and worried about that, and starts arguing that Alvarado was trying to bring in kind of communist influence into Peru with the plan of in the long term making Peru into a communist economy. They're already a dictatorship, so they might invite more and more Soviet influence into Peru to spread it to the rest of Latin America. So the U.S. leaders are looking at Alvarado suspiciously with this domino theory idea that bringing in a kind of Yugoslav-based company to build the canal in the first place is just his first step in a conspiracy to make Peru into a communist nation and Soviet allied nation maybe over the next 10 or 20 years. So there's not a whole lot of evidence for that, but that's what a lot of U.S. leaders seem to want to believe. So they're very critical of Alvarado, and they don't support much of this at all. And then Alvarado starts launching off on major nationalizations of especially foreign-owned companies in Peru itself, like oil companies, banks, like the Chase Manhattan Bank branch in Peru was nationalized, which angered the bank's leaders in New York City. And Chase Manhattan Bank even today is one of the giant banking and Wall Street type companies in the world. So it has a lot of influence with the U.S. government, and is very angry at Alvarado for having done this. But Alvarado doesn't stop there. His government continues other nationalizations like mining companies, which was another big part of the Peruvian economy. And of course the United States government is hostile to all these moves because they claim that this is the first step in building a communist economy. The U.S. government backs off its criticism of Alvarado's nationalizations when the Peruvian government agrees to basically compensate the owners of the property that have been nationalized to the tune of about $150 million in total. So in the 1960s and 70s, that's quite a lot of money. It could be probably over $500 million today. So that's quite a lot of money to pay out to companies that had owned that property and those businesses. So the U.S. government is still generally hostile toward Alvarado and the Peruvian government in general, but in this specific instance of these nationalizations, the U.S. kind of backs off its big criticism once the money starts to roll. And Alvarado and his government start making trade deals with China. They start opening foreign relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. So the U.S. is still always going to be pretty hostile toward Alvarado's government and the general Peruvian government going forward, because they say that this seems to be some kind of conspiracy of closet communists in Peru to bring Soviet influence into Latin America. So the United States is still very worried about a so-called second Cuba happening somewhere else in Latin America. And remember, this is about 1970 or so. This is only 10 years or so after Castro's success in Cuba. And there's also quite a lot of complaint amongst the Peruvian population against Alvarado's government. Mostly there's anger amongst, obviously the landowners that are losing lands because of the redistributions. There's anger among some peasant workers, especially in the sugar fields, who were unionized and didn't like being told what to do by the government. They wanted to, elect their own union leaders and negotiate their own union contracts and whatnot. So there's a couple parts of the population that are angry about this. And as they start to complain, some national newspapers and TV and radio stations start broadcasting their complaints, which the government didn't like. So the government goes in and takes control over newspapers, even shuts some of them down. Same with TV and radio stations, which convince a lot of journalists and intellectuals in the country that the government is moving toward increasing its dictator powers over the population and trying to control the information that is discussed in the society. And as you get into the 1970s, a lot of these economic proposals that the government is running don't really work very well. So the Peruvian economy largely stagnates in the 1970s. So their amount of exports shrink. The government was largely depending on the idea that they're going to find new oil reserves in Peru, which largely did not happen. So that expected amount of oil-based revenue that they hoped would prop up the economy just did not materialize. And then in the 1970s, like we've talked about before, copper prices go down on the world market. World sugar prices also go down. So really, Peru's economy is taking a hit in all its major sectors. And with government revenue going down and government expenditures often going up because of all these nationalizations, the government has to keep borrowing money to pay its bills. So that causes inflation, it causes the national debt to grow. And in the 1970s, the government is putting itself in a difficult position to the point where it has to go to international kind of bailout banks like the IMF, asking for loans to pay off its former loans as kind of a bailout type structure. And the IMF, with its normal demands for austerity, which means government budget cuts, says we'll give you the loan if you cut back on government spending. And the only real way that the Peruvian government could do so would be to cut government workers' wages by 40%. And with all these nationalizations, a lot of people had previously worked for private companies in the oil industry or banks or wherever. They're now government employees. So this government employee wage cut is going to reach pretty far and wide in the Peruvian society. But the government goes for it, and they do cut worker wages to cut the budget to get these bailout loans. And this was an outrage to the general population. So they start calling for new national elections, and in 1978 the government rewrites the Constitution. So they hold a constituent assembly, they rewrite the Constitution, and once that is finished, they call for new national democratic elections under the new Constitution to be held in 1980. So those elections will go forward and will elect some democratic leaders. So that's where Peru starts its transition back into a democracy. And the kind of military government's history, even beyond Alvarado, who retired in 75, the government had helped a lot of poor people escape poverty through land redistribution, through these nationalizations and whatnot, and had tried to organize them into a political base to continue supporting the government. But the government's mistakes economically were not enough to overcome those kind of successes in pulling people out of poverty. So by the late 70s, the general population is demanding democracy and open elections to the point where the government really has to give in. And that's largely because the economy was in such a bad position by the mid-70s, going up to the end of the decade. So even when the people got more land, they got more consistent jobs, those government employees took a 40% wage hit, and that angered them, and they were just not a reliable enough political base for the military government to continue. and the military government eventually released its control in 1980. So we'll generally stop here, and next time we'll talk about how the debt crisis that starts in Mexico in 1982 will have a massive effect throughout the rest of Latin America economically and politically. It will destabilize governments. But the main point again today was that we've seen several different governing systems that have run Ecuador, Panama, and Peru from 1960s and 70s going forward into the early 80s. And the U.S. government does not seem to care what type of government exists in a lot of Latin American countries, according to the case studies we've gone over today. The U.S. government doesn't really care if a democracy runs these countries as long as those elected leaders adhere to U.S. demands for their country. And the U.S. doesn't care if military dictators run these countries as long as those military dictators follow orders from the United States. So what the U.S. wants is some amount of influence in each of the Latin American countries, and doesn't particularly care about democracy or dictatorship, because the U.S. will support either type of government as long as it kind of follows orders. But the big problems start to arise when the political leadership starts making demands or taking actions that the U.S. government does not want. So the U.S. will assassinate leaders, will overthrow democracies if they think those democracies are moving in a direction that the U.S. doesn't like. Or the U.S. might complain about dictatorships, like in Peru, that were doing things that the U.S. government didn't like, and will take actions against those dictatorships. So it seems like the United States government is much more interested in getting its policy ideas in Latin America put into effect and kept as the kind of general direction that Latin America is heading, and is willing to use or attack democracy or dictatorship throughout Latin America, just depending on whether or not that country is going in the direction that the U.S. government wants. So that seems to be the general U.S. foreign policy for Latin America. So again, we'll stop here, and next time we'll go into the 1980s throughout the region.